I think we're all still processing the absolute stack of exciting announcements that Nintendo just made over the last week or so, stemming from that incredible Nintendo Switch 2 presentation. And as hyped as I am for 4K Nintendo games, the new Joy-Cons, the huge volume of third-party games, open world Mario Kart, and Nintendo's answer to the iToy, there was one announcement that 90s and early 2000s kids were understandably very emotional about. The GameCube is coming to Switch 2 Virtual Console, along with a whole host of masterpiece GameCube games that are now over 2 decades old. The GameCube is one of the most underrated consoles of all time. Its era brought us some of the best entries in pretty much every major Nintendo IP you can think of. Mario, Kirby, Zelda, Metroid, Smash Bros, Mario Kart, and of course, Pokémon. Pokémon Colosseum and XD Gale of Darkness were the first story-based entries to the Pokémon series to arrive on home console in the traditional RPG style, and they are beloved entries that were totally groundbreaking at the time, blending classic Pokémon gameplay with next-gen 3D graphics and slightly more mature themes. We'd only ever seen Gen 3 level Pokémon graphics in a true Pokémon RPG before this, so going from this to this, and it not just being a stadium-esque battle simulator, but a full-blown Pokémon story with developed characters, free exploration, and the brand new region of Ore was an unbelievable upgrade to Pokémon fans. It felt like home console Pokémon entries had truly arrived. Both games, released in 2003 and 2005 respectively, were huge commercial successes, and these days, the hard copies sell for big bucks. I still firmly believe that if Pokémon had been on the PS2, or if the GameCube had doubled up as a DVD player like its more commercially successful main competitor, the Colosseum games would have had a much larger impact on casual gamers and even the wider Pokémon fanbase in general. And maybe we would have seen more Colosseum titles on the Wii and Wii U. But over the years, Pokémon found continued success with its core handheld main series games, and also developed other very successful spin-offs to focus on like Mystery Dungeon, Conquest, and Pokémon Ranger. And so the Colosseum series faded away, with development of console Pokémon reverting back to focusing on stadium-style battle simulator games. And this culminated in the beautiful looking stadium successor for the Wii, Pokémon Battle Revolution. Whilst I've said many times that this game and its Poketopia theme park setting was the pinnacle of battle animations, art style, grand battle arenas, and atmospheric fights, it suffered from replayability and limited customization when it came to actual battle rule sets, gameplay, and even things like being able to shorten the duration of the animations. And much like the Colosseum series, that faded away for many years as well, until the very recent Pokémon Champions announcement, which seems to be the ultimate revival of official Pokémon battle simulators, possibly even dethroning the unofficial Pokémon Showdown. But all of this means that the Colosseum series sits kind of lost in time, its true potential perhaps never fully realized, and we'll never know what could have been if development of the series had continued. However, with the new GameCube Switch 2 announcement, Colosseum and XD Gale of Darkness are confirmed titles, meaning not only will the nostalgic 90s and early 2000s kids be able to relive these glorious additions to the franchise, but so too will younger generations who never got to play the games the first time round. And I truly believe that this decision potentially indicates that Colosseum and XD Gale of Darkness will get either 4K remakes so that we can see Wes, the Ore region, and Shadow Lugia in 4K glory, much like Pokémon Snap did a few years ago for the Switch, or potentially we could see an actual sequel or spiritual successor. Now, I want to make it clear that the simple fact that they're going to be playable on the Virtual Console does not in itself indicate that any sort of 4K remake or sequel is going to become available for the Switch 2. However, we are going to explore many other indicators that could suggest a new Colosseum game is coming during the Switch 2 era. The possibility of revitalizing the series as a business decision could be very fruitful for the Pokémon Company, and I promise you, the Pokémon Company have people that will be constantly assessing all of the spin-off properties that they own right now. And as one of only a few Pokémon titles that have not received any updates for 20+ years, they'll be considering this as a very real possibility, as they have done and will continue to do with many of their other legacy titles. We discussed earlier that Pokémon Stadium and Battle Revolution are soon to be spiritually revitalized with Pokémon Champions. In 2020, Mystery Dungeon DX was released as a full-fledged HD console remake of the original GBA and DS Mystery Dungeon titles. The following year, new Pokémon Snap was released as a modern reimagination of the classic Nintendo 64 title that came out 22 years prior. Then, in 2024, Pokémon TCG Pocket came out as yet another modern spiritual successor to the Game Boy Color title, the TCG video game, and of course as a way to capitalize on the huge popularity of the smartphone market as well as the actual TCG landscape itself. And so we see a consistent pattern that Pokémon, given enough time, do not abandon their commercially successful spin-off games. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure we can even call the Colosseum games a spin-off series. I can imagine that the people in the room developing Colosseum at the time were probably pretty convinced that the 3D console direction for Pokémon could in fact be a new mainstream direction for the franchise. And today, you could probably equate it to a Legends or Let's Go game, in the sense that it's not a brand new main series generational installment, but it is technically considered a main series game that borrows a lot of mechanics and functionality from the core main series, albeit with its own slight gimmick or unique style. And again, even though the GameCube was a fantastic console with an array of iconic games, the fact that it just could not get close to the numbers of its competitor, the PS2, or even Nintendo's own extremely successful handheld consoles, means it just wasn't able to have the impact that it perhaps could have. But now that's entirely changed. The Switch is the third and possibly soon to be the second or even first best-selling console of all time, selling over 7 times the amount of units that the GameCube managed. Much like the PS2 in its day, everyone has a Switch, and despite some potential pricing issues out the gate, I think the Switch 2 over the course of its generational cycle is going to put up similar numbers, and will at the very least massively outsell the GameCube. And this sales potential is one huge reason why it makes so much sense for the sheer ambition of the Colosseum titles to be fully realized on a console that actually is massively commercially successful, as we're now seeing with other classic GameCube games. If the Colosseum games had come out on the Switch, you can bet they would have done some serious numbers. So why haven't they? Well, we don't know for sure, but there are probably a few reasons that have stopped them from going for it. Firstly, Colosseum is less simple to make than, for example, a Mystery Dungeon or Pokémon Snap game. Whilst Snap from a character model perspective looks spectacular and clearly had a lot of work put into it, and likewise Mystery Dungeon DX is a beautiful game that was built with a lot of care and effort, they're both quite contained and formulaic games with more linear level designs. That's not to say they're easy to make, but compared to a fully fledged immersive 3D Pokémon game, the amount of effort that goes into a project like that needs to be huge. It's essentially much bigger in scale, with more elements to think about, and we already see that Pokémon have struggled somewhat with the transition from their tile-based and handheld worlds up to a meaningful 3D RPG experience in the Switch era. In 2018, Let's Go was an upscaled, high-res version of Pokémon Yellow, enabling players to experience Kanto with high-res assets and animations. In 2019, Sword and Shield, though clean-looking, was still a pretty contained and linear world when it came to the cities and routes. It was only the Wild area and the Crown Tundra DLC for those games in late 2020 that really started to explore what a truly open 3D modern Pokémon world could look like. After that point, yes, it's possible they could have started working on a new Colosseum title, but main series remake demand and internal timelines forced them to work on both the Switch version of Pokémon Platinum, aka Legends Arceus, as well as the next-gen titles Scarlet and Violet, both in 2022, and both of which continue to improve on the execution of a true console open-world RPG format. So it would really be kind of now that there could be an opportunity to work on a Colosseum-like title, and the Switch 2 hardware really would allow the original ambition on visuals and gameplay to be realized. The Legends ZA release could have been the perfect project slot for a new Colosseum installment, but the GameCube software for Switch 2 was yet to be announced until literally last week, so it might just be that they want to see how many people play the originals through the Virtual Console first before committing to such a big project, because Colosseum and XD really do sit in a peculiar place in time for the company, where they don't necessarily have good or definitive definitive data on how big revisiting the series could really be. Even if people didn't have Colosseum or XD back in the day, and therefore didn't factor into the original sales figures, people still very much knew about them and wanted to play them. I know that was certainly true for me. I didn't have a GameCube growing up, but as soon as my household got hold of the Nintendo Wii, I was borrowing Colosseum from kids in my class and finally experiencing what I think is one of the best and most complete 3D Pokemon games ever made. But even if all of this is true, would a Colosseum title really fit in the mid-2020s climate, over 20 years on from the original release? Does the story and art style still work, and would the game be able to do the numbers? I've got one word for you: cyberpunk. The mid-2000s was huge for the cyberpunk aesthetic and saw 3 of the most authentic cyberpunk-inspired Pokemon titles we've ever received, and they were Colosseum, XD, and Battle Revolution, all developed by Genius Sonority, a developer that is largely composed of those who worked on the Dragon Quest series. Just looking at these games now, you can see that 3D Pokemon was visually going in this retro-futuristic direction with neon lights, cool tech, and shadowy corporations, something that handheld Pokemon RPGs always kind of implied and conveyed, but just didn't have the hardware power to fully realize until Colosseum. And this style, in my opinion, is perfect for Pokemon. The style was not only typical of the Japanese fantasy aesthetic, but it also translated so well to the world of video games in general, and still does to this day. Cyberpunk 2077 itself, which came out in 2020, is one of the best-selling video games of all time at 30 million copies, rivaling the very best of the Pokemon franchise. And Pokemon are no strangers to a blatant mainstream reference for inspiration. If Breath of the Wild has evidently been their reference point for the main series in the Switch era, there's no reason why games like Cyberpunk and Deathloop couldn't be points of reference for a new Colosseum game when it comes to assets and visuals. And if branded in a way that appeals to both the mainstream and multiple generations of Pokemon fans, it could absolutely be a groundbreaking smash hit on the 4K Switch 2 hardware. And whilst we don't know the exact style of Gen 10 yet, the 2 most in-demand regions when it comes to remakes are Johto and Unova, both of which have stories and settings that could lend themselves beautifully to that cyberpunk style. Pokemon have to be smart and think macro when building new 3D models and animations in 4K, and so they could have an overarching approach across multiple Switch 2 games when it comes to style, vibe, and atmosphere. Whilst I think the style seen in Sun and Moon, Scarlet and Violet, and ZA is clearly something they feel is perhaps more safe and family friendly for the main series, perhaps for the remake entries, we could see a stylistic switch up, like how Legends Arceus kind of did its own thing with its beautiful cel-shaded style. Unova in particular lends itself heavily to a more cyberpunk style, and not only that, but the Ore region featured in the Colosseum and XD titles is kind of part of Unova. Unova encompasses New York and New Jersey, and Ore is more of a Wild West feel based on Phoenix, Arizona, both of which are of course in the United States. So if, and really when, Pokemon start developing the Gen 5 remakes or Legends game, of course they are going to be having conversations about how Ore, and potentially even other new regions that could fall into the Pokemon equivalent of the USA, could fit in. Gen 5 also gave us one of the most high stakes and consequential plots of all time, exploring themes of child abandonment, splicing DNA, and of course the ideas of freedom and liberty. This all ties in beautifully well with the snagging theme of Colosseum and XD Gale of Darkness, where the player had to catch shadow Pokemon who are under the artificial control of Team Snag'em, and also involved darker themes of kidnapping, theft, and consequential violence. So if branded and executed correctly in a way that appeals to both traditional Pokemon fans and casual gamers, a new Colosseum game could definitely happen and be an absolute hit for Switch 2. But what do you think? Would you prefer to see a remaster, a sequel, or a spiritual successor? How would it fit in with the main series and the Legends sub-series? And how likely do you think it is to arrive in the Switch 2 era? Let me know all of your thoughts down below, and until next time, love you gang.